and we'll go ahead and start the webinar. And good late morning, almost afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. We're thrilled that you're able to join us here for this lunch and learn session that we're having today. We've got a good one lined up for you. You're in the right place. This is the ISACA South Florida webinar on securing distributed healthcare and other organizations. Also, just cloud protection and cloud workload protection in general, but with a special emphasis on some certain types of topics that that Red Canary and Nick Lees will be talking about today. So we're really excited about presenting this content to you. We're going to go ahead and allow just a couple of minutes as people are filtering into this session. We know that it takes a couple of seconds to load. We know that people are hopping out of one meeting and hopping into another meeting. So it's a nice opportunity to allow people to go ahead and join the session without missing any of the great content. Then I'll get into the introductory types of announcements in just a moment. So if you're looking for ISACA South Florida's free webinar on securing distributed healthcare and other organizations, all about securing the remote workforce with an emphasis on cloud security, you're certainly in the right place, and we're glad to have you with us today. And in just another moment, we'll be getting started with this presentation as we start to approach 12 o'clock and go ahead and make our announcements. So it looks like we're right about at that hour. So we'll go ahead and move into the introductory announcements, which I promise will be brief. First of all, so that I don't forget, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself once again. My name's Rob Valdez. I'm currently volunteering as the president of ISACA South Florida. And as you'll hear, elections are coming up. The officers are on 2-year terms. So I'll continue to be volunteering for the next year, even from now, or approximately 15 months. Is how long I'll be in this position. It's my pleasure to continue volunteering for you, along with a group of other very hardworking people who make this happen behind the scenes, including Lynn Cotton, Director at Large, who was instrumental in making this happen, Maria Aris, Director of Certifications, who's always very helpful in coordinating and especially helping getting the CPE certificates distributed to you afterwards. We're extremely grateful for that. Sandra Paris, our Director of Programming, who is absolutely critical to making all this type of activity come together and come to fruition, and to whom we are continuously grateful. So making sure to introduce those people as well, even though they're not necessarily going to be on screen in this presentation, as I do these announcements right now, which are these general introductions and administrative items. Just like we always say and we always mention in these types of conversations, we encourage you to use the Zoom client for the best experience in this. We know that not everyone can use the Zoom client, right? There are different types of administrative restrictions or other types of restrictions on your local host. So maybe you're not using the Zoom client, but if you can, that is oftentimes the best experience. Chrome is typically the next best option, because we will be making use of things such as the question and answer functionality in the session today, because at a couple of points, perhaps Nick will pause during the presentation and ask if there's any questions that are coming through. And if you have been putting in your questions in the Q&A module that's in the toolbar of this session, if you've been putting those types of things in, at that moment, we can go ahead and let Nick know that there's a question. He can kind of field that throughout so that it's a little bit more of an interactive experience. And that's something that we'll definitely make sure to use to the best of its ability. You have the best access to that in the actual client. The next best access is probably through the Chrome browser. Technical issues, if there are any, can be sent through the chat. There are very limited things that we can do to help you during the session. However, we will certainly try when and where those types of things are possible. This lunch and learn session will go for an hour. As you can see, it's from 12 to 1. I'm just doing the brief administrative announcements. I'll be finishing up here in just a second. Then the feature presentation will go for approximately 50 minutes, including time for question and answers throughout and perhaps at the end, just depending on the flow. And then at the final couple of moments, we'll wrap up with our final comments and outlook for the calendar. A reminder that we're currently soliciting self-nomination forms for people who want to serve on ISACASFL Florida, and we would encourage you to do that, which we'll mention after this session. There will be 1 hour of CPE credit that's available for this session. The certs will be sent within 1 week. Make sure to use your to sign into Zoom using your real name if possible, if that's something that you have the ability to do, so that we can link it to your registration. We are working on additional integrations in the back end to try and make this even smoother. You know, there are a number of things that will help to make this sort of things possible. In the meantime, with the system that is in place, those types of activities help us make that happen and make it as smooth and effective as it can be. So now it's my pleasure to go ahead and move into what you're actually here for, which is our guest presentation from Nick Lees, Director of Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Red Canary. And Nick is an information security, data privacy, audit, and infrastructure professional. He specializes in a number of frameworks like ISO 27001, HITRUST, HIPAA, HITECH, GDPR, and privacy frameworks, SOC 2, CCPA, and NIST. He has almost 2 decades of practical experience in various industries with expertise in information security, data privacy compliance, third-party risk, cloud computing on platforms such as Microsoft Azure and AWS, data center rationalization and consolidation, and strategic planning and virtualization for things such as networking and storage. So please go ahead and take it away, Nick.
Thanks very much. I will share my screen here real quick. Perfect. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to the ISACASFL Florida chapter. Always like doing this kind of thing, so appreciate the opportunity to be invited to speak with you all today. So quick bit of intro on myself. I'll try and live up to the expectations that Rob set there. So as said, I'm Nick. I'm the Director of GRC at Red Canary, based in Denver, Colorado. So I lead Red Canary's GRC program. Got about 20 years experience. Actually come from more of an infrastructure engineering background, and kind of got into security and compliance in the last 5 years. Bit of a kind of weird career shift, going into compliance rather than, you know, sometimes going from compliance in the other direction. And I'm a member of the ISACA Denver chapter, so based in Colorado myself, despite the accent. So with that, let's dive into it. So quick agenda for today. So I'll go over current risk environment, threat landscape, take a look at why we think healthcare is a particular target. We'll take a look at some healthcare exploitation vectors, actors, and tactics. Look at some telehealth security challenges, particularly important at the moment. Kind of take a look at how can we, as professionals, what can we do to make things better? And then we'll wrap up with some Q&A as well. So, and just a quick bit of admin to mention. So we are doing a t-shirt giveaway as well. We've got some information on the very last slide at the end. So if you want to stick around and get some free swag, don't bail before the last slide. So, all right, let's dive in. So how bad have things really got? Let's take a look at cybersecurity by the numbers. So ransomware damages, they're up 15 times since 2015. 56% of all breaches take months or longer to discover. Only 27% of people are confident that their current antivirus or security solutions will protect their company from ransomware. Some additional stats. 76% of all breaches are financially motivated, and ransomware is now estimated to be worth about $5 billion a year. 4,000 ransom attacks have occurred daily since January 1st, 2016, and 50% of all crimeware incidents now involve ransomware. Finally, 58% of breach victims are categorized as small businesses. What's that telling us? Maybe current approaches to security are not effective. Average attack dwell time in 2018, 78 days. So that's a long time for an attacker to be living potentially in your network with access to your information. Average cost of a data breach is almost $4 million. Stolen credentials are the most common type of breach. And the average number of security tools in an environment is now 75. So that's a lot of tools looking at the same information and potentially providing you with a lot of data that you've got to look through. There's a lot of white noise there. So those numbers on the previous slide, not looking positive, and they're all from before the recent pandemic hit. The reality now is that teams have even less visibility and control with more remote devices at a time when our threat team's research shows that attacks rose by as much as 148% month over month since the pandemic hit. Unfortunately, during times of uncertainty and doubt, threat actors are ready to take advantage of the widespread desire to be informed. This is already happening with coronavirus based on research done by our threat analysis unit and various other intelligence teams like across the industry. People and businesses who are already in a heightened state of emotion and an overload with changes in all aspects of their lives are now at risk from bad actors intent on stealing personal information, sensitive information, payment details, and more, simply by using luring tactics that feature coronavirus-themed malware. While this technique isn't new, history has proven that cybercrime often increases during times of heightened emotion, distraction, and stress, such as certain religious or festive holidays, elections, and even Black Friday sales events. Actors exploit these challenging times to find avenues for distributing their malware. Our threat analysis unit is continuing to track this trend and has seen a correlation between significant news events related to this pandemic and an increase in the number of cyber attacks occurring per day across the globe. So looking at the threat landscape, the need for security in the workplace has been completely changed in the last year by the new remote reality. Many organizations now lack visibility into their endpoints. Your network is now not your perimeter. It uses individual endpoints and not the perimeter. Without this kind of visibility, you're flying blind about attacks that threaten your endpoints. People are depending on legacy antivirus software or security tools that don't really do anything to address preventing, detecting, or responding to ransomware and other non-malware attacks. Criminals are opportunists, right? So it's not surprising that malicious actors are taking advantage of this new reality. They are targeting the way employees connect to their workspaces from their homes. They are increasing their use of social engineering, phishing campaigns, denial of service attacks, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities in home routers. Attackers will always go where the open surface is. I just want to take a pause right now and see if there's any questions so far.
Let's see, none come in the Q&A session yet. I'm checking the chat. Nothing come in the chat quite yet.
All right. On that, I will search forward. So why do we think healthcare is a particular target? There's a few reasons for this. Firstly, health records are quite often more valuable than other records. I mean, as an example, credit card details, right? A credit card record, it's worth on the black market about $5 per credit card number. But a healthcare record can be worth anywhere between $250 to over $1,000 on the black market. I mean, why is this, right? They have a longer lifetime, first and foremost. Like, if you need a replacement credit card, that's pretty easy, right? You call up your provider, they cancel your card, they send you a new one, no problem. But I don't know how many people have ever tried changing a social security number. It's a lot more difficult than that. So that tends to stay with you for your life. So And with this kind of information, they can then quite easily assume your identity. Then they can abuse credit, and then perhaps even prescriptions as well. And they can also use these health records to find targets to potentially bribe or blackmail people with health problems that would not otherwise be known. As well, healthcare is quite often seen as a soft target. Healthcare providers are inseparably tied to technology that keeps people alive. For instance, what medication to issue and how much, which procedures to perform on who, etc. These are kind of things that you don't change lightly. Being down for any period of time can mean as well that people are sent elsewhere for critical care. There's also, layer 8 problems, bureaucracy, lack of support. It can be hard sometimes to get the right expertise and tools. Healthcare organizations are quite often resistant to change. Also have trouble finding and keeping the right talent. Often in healthcare, software and support is heavily outsourced, which increases reliance on contractors and third parties. As well, you quite often have a network of connected providers. So in that kind of position, you have to trust everyone or be really, really good at guarding your entry points. Many healthcare providers also find themselves with mounting tech debt. They have lots of older, unpatched systems, which goes back to my earlier point about providers being inseparably tied to technology that keeps people alive. There's also little financial incentive to patch older devices. And what's the result? Breaches and ransomware cost the healthcare industry around $4 billion in 2019. So let's look at some trends. Exploitation vectors aren't unique. They're typically the same thing we've seen for years. It's unpatched services, so things like remote access and remote admin and email. Look at the actors. Some people say they won't target healthcare, but that's if you believe them or if you take their word for it. We've seen some named groups such as Deep Panda, and they were attributed to the Anthem breach. 40% of all targets for ransomware are actually healthcare related. We see things like backdoors with lateral movement, recon persistence, unique hash on each system. And, most actors, whether they're sophisticated or not, have figured out how to monetize a health record better than a credit card record. Kind of like we were saying before, there's more information there. There's health information, there's social security numbers, etc. And then tactics and techniques. Many threat actors aren't even trying to hide at all, because most people can't even find them, even if they're being noisy inside their own network. They perform noisy reconnaissance, such as scanning for SMB shares, scanning for accounts, groups, etc. They disable shadow copies, delete backups. Many of actors that we see haven't materially changed their tactics, techniques, and procedures for years. Why is that? Well, they don't have to if they're getting what they want, right? There's no reason to change. They're only going to change their tactics, techniques, and procedures when forced to by, winning detection and prevention strategies. If we're not winning, then there's no need for them to change what they're doing. Some quick information on, or some thoughts on ransomware and other attacks in hospitals. So there's been predictions for a while, that the first death due to a cyber attack was imminent. There was actually a death in Germany last year that was attributed to a cyber attack. The actor targeted vulnerability in Citrix, and this was something where a patch had been available actually since January 2020, but the system had remained unpatched. When the actor found out that his malware was attacking a hospital, he actually provided a description key and took a step back. But by the time that happened, patients had to be rerouted, which led to someone getting care later, and it may have contributed to their death. It's a slippery slope to attribute this death directly to a cyber attack because uncertainty does matter. But we are already living in a world where technology working as expected is a difference between living and dying in some instances. And I'll take a pause here and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, there is, Nick. A question came in because in the beginning you were talking about the remote and distributed workforce creating even additional susceptibility. So there's a question that came in: why? What is it about a remote workforce that creates more susceptibility? Is it that controls are not in place for personal devices that are used for business functions, are secured laptops not being issued to remote workers? Are there some factors that are specifically contributing to that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, this can come down to really like a lack of unpreparedness from certain organizations as well. So a lot of times, organizations have thought of their whole network as their perimeter, right? And everything inside of that is inherently safe if they've got correct controls in place. But if all of a sudden you're making a huge pivot to a remote workforce and your people are taking computers off their desks and taking them home and plugging them into their home networks, like unless you've got proper controls in place on those machines, they could be a risk. Like, do you have properly centrally managed like antivirus and anti-malware? Do you have an EDR endpoint protection solution in place? Are all your devices like centrally managed? Are you using an MDM solution where you can easily like get visibility into what's happening on the device? Can you enforce encryption? Can you reduce the use of USB memory sticks, things like that? Can you remote wipe the machine? Can you disable the machine? I mean, it's a great question. It's just illustrating the point that it's very important to make sure you've got correct controls on your endpoint, not just on your network perimeter.
Excellent. Makes a lot of sense.
Great. All right. So I'm gonna kind of take a step here into some kind of more technical things now. So I'm gonna kind of take a run through of some of the things that we of Red Canary have seen kind of in the last year. So what we're taking a look at here is some information that's come out of our platform. So everything here is completely anonymized. So, but this is an example ransomware attack. And kind of what you're seeing here is a list of information that's being sent from an endpoint sensor on a user's machine that's being sent out to Red Canary for analysis. So bit of background here, we were brought in mid-compromised, so the event was already taking place when we got involved. So what you can see happening here is that the actors on the network, and you can see that they're moving around the network via SMB shares. They're not trying to hide their movements at all here. So they're not trying to be secretive. They're in there. It's as if they're really not bothered at this point if they're going to get detected. So you can see what they do here. So they copy Mimikatz, which is a ransomware program. Again, they're not trying to hide. They're not even bothered to change the file name, for instance, to try and avoid detection. Next thing they do is they run psexec from the compromised machine. And from there, they can kick off PowerShell to start their encryption. They then use PowerShell to perform some tests and kick off another executable. Now, they're killing the organization's shadow copies and backups. Then they drop some encryption instructions for decryption, and then they get to work. This is it now. The damage is done. So what are the takeaways from this? There's a lot of places to catch all this if you have visibility, but ransomware isn't something that you want to catch purely with detective controls, because at that point, it's too late. You really want to have preventative controls in place. It's too automated, right? By the time that you're just getting a preview of how bad your day is going to get. So there's great resources out there and practical strategies to help stop this thing before it gets out of control. So not just EDR. I mean, that's a great tool, but there's many other tools out there as well. All right. Let's look at another one. So Blue Mockingbird, which is a crypto mining ransomware or crypto mining application. So Blue Mockingbird breaches vulnerable web services. Then it will escalate privilege on the machine and start using your resources for crypto mining. So we've actually found this in healthcare before as well. So it exploits a particular library that's commonly used in .NET web applications. It'll get in, it will escalate privileges, abuse IAS, and then harvest credentials via Mimikatz, which was the example we saw in the last example. In this example here, since a particular environment variable was configured, every process that loaded the Microsoft.NET Common Language runtime would execute the command above, re-establishing persistence. So it's there, very difficult to get rid of. And then Blue Mockingbird also maintains multiple DLLs in case the service is found and killed. It just simply recopies itself and gets to work again. So the takeaway here is, without being able to see this command line running here, you'd be really blind that this was happening at all. I mean, you might stumble across the service and kill it, or kill its corresponding DLL, but because of how it works, it maintains multiple DLLs and it can recopy itself. It would just replace itself and start running again in short order. One of the kind of problems here is how people view crypto mining as well. People kind of see it almost like adware, they don't take it seriously, like it's more of annoyance. But one thing to remember is this is still an actor who is on your machine, it's on your network, and it's stealing from you and your company. And the only thing that's keeping them from dropping a ransomware binary and demanding a ransom from you is literally their mood. They've already compromised your network at this point. All right. Let's take a look at Cobalt Strike. So this example, it was a Cobalt Strike beacon that we found on a server hosting health records and providing telehealth services. So we found the Cobalt Strike beacon, and it was predating our monitoring. As bad enough day as that is, in this case, the beacon was sitting on a server hosting a specialized healthcare application that was facilitating telehealth. So right now, it's critical. So what are the takeaways from this? You really want to catch them like long before they set up deep within your network. And at that point, they're very difficult to remove. You can find Cobalt Strike via, there's a few things, named pipes, so you can see the Cobalt Strike's lateral movement. You can look at the start WDLL function. Again, that will detect lateral movement. And you can also find it through other mechanisms like network snort rules and fingerprinted Cobalt Strike servers that are tracked by things like services like Showdown, but these are fragile because they're subject to change. There's also a really great white paper, which I've linked in the notes. So, because you'll get a copy of the slides afterwards, called the Art and Science of Detecting Cobalt Strike. That's by Talos. That's a really, really interesting read. So definitely recommend taking a look at that. So, any questions on that at all?
Yeah, a couple of things actually come to mind, Nick. Like, let's
Sure.
say we're we're walking through the process of the execution of the malware, and we can see that these things happen, and oftentimes just a couple of seconds is how quickly these things are executing, which is why it was one of the many reasons why many times as GRC professionals, we're talking to our audiences about things like even higher level things like network segregation, right? As far as separating or reducing the impact of these sorts of exploits actually happening.
Yeah.
But sometimes putting these sorts of things in place really ends up being an exercise that's far easier said than done, and can take time to implement over time. So as far as putting some of these types of strategies in place, even security architecture types of strategies in place, since we know that these projects take time, since we know that the threat is critical, what are some of your thoughts about sort of like complementary types of activities, sort of mitigating types of activities, those kinds of things that from the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So network segregation's a great, I don't want to say easy, but a great place to start, right? So, because that's a great way of containing anything like this. So you want to make sure you've got, for instance, your development or your QA or your research networks, make sure they're completely separate from perhaps your corporate network and then your production network. Make sure that you're not hosting personal information or health records on people's machines. Make sure that stays within a production environment, and make sure you've got proper controls in place so that data can't move between the two. And then, if it's bad, something bad happens and a user's laptop or workstation does get compromised, at least you can contain it to either that workstation or that network. I mean, that's a great place to start. And just, make sure your network folks are configuring everything as least privilege, just make sure nothing, so no person or no service has access to anything it doesn't need to have access to. Same with the network as well. Don't have don't allow ports or services that you really don't need. Just restrict everything down as much as possible. So as much as like, these permissions restrictions and things like these might seem like a pain to users, they will get used to it, and it's a lot better than the alternative. So there's some easy things you can start with. So, and totally get it, like coming up with like a comprehensive, security solution that's going to cover your entire infrastructure estate is not an easy task. So yeah, start with the things you can do easily and then go from there.
Another thought that's coming in from the audience is, you're going through some specific executables, some specific name processes, referencing even to well-known tools that are being used, for nefarious purposes. And if we know the names of these executables, we know these specific processes. Why, can't we sort of stop these things from happening? Why isn't anti-malware necessarily able to keep up with this? Is there something else that's kind of preventing this from being as effective? Maybe rapid new development of variants or other things like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So rapid development. So I mean, you can, as a user, you can take a look out for certain executables or DLLs that you might see that are running on your machine, right? But if an attacker's already compromised your machine, they could keep changing the name of the executable, right? So you've got to continue to be looking out for it. And things like antivirus and anti-malware, they work against signatures, right? So they can only protect against things they know about, which is where something like an EDR solution will just point out kind of any activity that looks suspicious or is out of the norm. So that's why like proper endpoint protection is really useful. So I mean, certainly things you can look at, like if you're going to be the victim of a ransomware attack on your machine, you're going to know about it pretty quickly. So with a pop-up or something like that. So, but like I was saying before with Blue Mockingbird, a crypto miner, it's not always that obvious if it's running in the background, but you can see quite easily, look at processes that are running on your machine, is something using all your memory and using all your CPU power. That would be perhaps an indicator, especially if it's an executable that you don't recognize. That would be a good indicator that something's maybe not right there.
And now you're bringing up a good point as well, right? Because there's a number of professionals on this call who, for example, maybe risk management professionals, right, and are responsible for the analysis and assessment of all different types of risk, the quantification of that type of risk, communicating with those charged with governance at a very high level, at a strategic and an organizational level. And they're not necessarily people who are going to recognize PowerShell scripts, who are constantly checking their running processes. Any thoughts for those types of professionals as well, to identify indicators of compromise or detect those types of maneuvers in their devices?
Only with, well, if they've got good visibility, yeah. But I mean, kind of what I would say for kind of audit professionals and risk management professionals is kind of just being aware of like the shift that's happened in the last year. I mean, this is certainly something we've done. We've had to refine, for example, our third-party risk process, because so many of the vendors that we work with, their workforces are now 100% remote, right? So we want to know that their endpoints have got adequate protection against this kind of thing, especially if they're processing our data for us. So, part of our approach to looking at third-party risk has changed now, because there's so much importance on making sure that like individual endpoints are protected rather than just, a corporate network or a corporate facility, something like that. So that's one example where our kind of thought process has really changed in the last year. So
Here's another question that's coming in. How about, since there's some specific types of products, or at least product classes, that are becoming more well known and better understood, especially for like audit types of individuals, asking and providing assurance to their organizations about these types of things in place. Generally speaking, is something like an IDS IPS, intrusion detection system and intrusion prevention system, a better protection from malware? And then the question goes on to say, antivirus checks for these things that already happen, how can we defend from upcoming non-recognized signatures, those types of activities?
yeah, something like an IDS IPS, good example there, because you're looking for any kind of activity on your network that might be suspicious, right? Rather than just like checking for something against the signature. So that's really important. But what comes out of that is then what you do with that data. Like things like IDS and IPS can be really, really noisy. So you've got to make sure you've got, a good team of people at the other end that are looking at these logs and they know what to look out for, and they can tell, what's potentially a false positive versus, what could be like a real attack, or a real threat that we need to take a look at. So
makes a lot of sense. So I suppose that kind of starts to open the additional conversation about, first of all, tuning the solutions that are in place and any types of procedures that are being put in place over those models to make sure they're not producing too many false positives or missing false negatives or whatever. So assurance around those processes, and then second, the incident response types of processes as well, identifying events, anomalies, in responding to the actual things, isolating, containing, and quarantining, if we're going to be using, terminology that we've become all too familiar with, of those types of compromised devices as well, right?
yeah, I mean, it goes back to a point I mentioned kind of right at the beginning of the talk, where like the average organization's like suite of security tools, it could be 75 different tools, right? That's a lot of alerts coming out of tools, right? It's a lot of information being processed. Like that can very quickly become useless, right? If all it's doing is producing white noise. So you got to, it's great having the tool, but only if you've implemented it properly and you've tuned it properly. It's really looking at things you want it to look at, and the information that's coming out of it is really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got, even a couple more questions coming in. Is it okay for me to continue? Should we hold off? You tell me.
Now let's carry on. So yeah, there's a couple more coming in before we move forward. So
Wonderful. Okay, so here's a question that's coming in. GRC is such an important part of the overall security posture of an organization. How do you see the ability to narrow down the noise of security events, kind of what we're talking about, right? With the importance of a sound GRC process within a healthcare organization specifically. It would be nice to narrow down the noise and work on security of events that are of value, all while adhering to overall policies and the requirements of the organization.
wow, it's a great question. I mean, it's certainly nice to think that people consider GRC when thinking about how to perhaps get the best information out of their logs and have the best people accessing them and things like that. So, I mean, in terms of compliance and logs and frameworks and things, you're going to be concerned about who has access to the logs and things like that, right? So, it kind of goes back to the point I was making before, really. Like the best thing you can do is to make sure all of your tools are well tuned, so they're looking at the specifics that you're really concerned about, and so that you're sure that the information coming out of them is sound. And then making sure you've got a good incident response team on the other end that are ready to act on any threats that you think might be realized. So I know
Excellent.
that was a bit of a general answer, but yeah, that's a good question I could probably go into for way longer than this webinar. So
Yeah, well, as GRC professionals, I'm sure we have a lot to say on those types of topics, right?
yeah, it's always nice when someone thinks of GRC like ahead of time rather than after the fact, So people quite often seem to ask for our forgiveness rather than our permissions.
All right, thanks. That's the questions that we have for now.
All right, let's move on. So, sorry, jump forward there. All right, so let's take a look at some telehealth challenges. So, kind of what we've been speaking to with these last few slides. So, most providers weren't well positioned to switch to telehealth at all. It's a very quick change for everyone. So a lot of people just ended up, kind of cobbling something together or buying something net new very quickly. And that leads to little time spent vetting solutions, and, a larger reliance on the third party kind of goes back to maybe not thinking about GRC too much, right? It's buying something and asking for forgiveness rather than asking for our permission first. Then you've got potential bring your own device woes. You've got unmanaged systems on either side now. if someone's bringing their own device and you've not got any kind of like detective or preventive controls on it, like who knows what could happen at that point. Got supply chain problems in the last year, procurement challenges, that kind of thing for hardware, software, and security solutions as well. So had process breakdowns, there's an increase in requests for sensitive data via insecure methods now, via email. Now people are working remotely, they don't have access to all the stuff that they had before, maybe secure fax lines, that kind of thing. I mean, you got an example here. You have an employee that's been working remotely on their own device. They're a little bit outside of their comfort zone. They're working with a patient. They need their patient's full health history, which can include like their social security number, scans of their driver's license, etc. They haven't been given proper guidance of what to do in this situation, so they just ask the patient like, oh, well, why don't you just email it all to me? Emails them to them, then the employee's fished and they've got all these records there in their mailbox, which now the attacker has access to. So just an example of some of the challenges we're facing there. So but moving on, it's not all doom and gloom, right? So there's lots of things that we can do as professionals to help make this better. Firstly, most importantly, patch everything. So if a patch is available, get it tested in a lower environment, make sure it's not going to adversely affect your network in any way, and get things patched. Speaking back to the ransomware event in Germany that was attributed to the loss of someone's life, it was a known vulnerability that was compromised there. So there'd been a patch available for 7 months. The organization just hadn't applied it. Just shows how important this is. So make sure your organization's got a really, really solid vulnerability management program. So for sensitive systems that don't change often, application control and system hardening is another like really good and really viable option. So if you've got some infrastructure that's largely static and it's not going to change, you can do things like remove PowerShell from the machine if it's not needed. That takes away an attack surface from a potential attacker. So something's really important: emphasize security awareness, and this is for like everyone, like even your customers as well. So if you're asking someone to, like a patient, to share health records with you, educate them in the most secure way to do that. Is there a way they can send you like information securely through an app like Signal or something like that, right, rather than like directly emailing it to you? And do the same with your own staff. Make sure they know about these things too. Like if someone's going to say to them, hey, I'll just email you this, just stop, take a step back, say, hey, we've got a secure file transfer platform we can use instead. We can use Signal. There's other ways you can get this to me which is safer. The best detective control really you're going to have is an informed human. So make sure your employees are adequately paranoid about security. Make sure they know who to call if there's a problem or if there's anything they're unsure about. Let them know, hey, don't you be the reason we get breached. So anything you're not sure about, ask a question, like, no matter how stupid it might seem, right? If you work in healthcare, like have conversations with your patients about keeping up with their own medical devices that they might have, basic patching, things like that. Have a really solid third-party risk program. Like we've talked about this before, like this has changed for us massively in the last year, like it's changed for everyone. Like make sure you're asking your third parties the right questions. It's not just good enough that they've got good controls like on their core infrastructure in a data center now. Like if their staff are working remotely, make sure they've got the correct controls in place on all of their users' endpoints. Make sure they're centrally managed. Make sure they're doing things like restricting data transfer onto USB drives and things like that. Make sure they've got procedures in place if there's an incident with a machine. If something gets like, if a machine gets lost or gets stolen out of someone's car or something like that, can they wipe it remotely? Are they educating their staff in good remote working policies? Have they got staff working in coffee shops, and they don't have screen guards on their machines and that kind of thing? Are they having conversations, in public places where, they're discussing people's health records, that kind of thing? Like, just make sure you cover all this kind of thing. So yeah, identify weaknesses in potential weaknesses in third-party programs. Like make sure they're following best practices, ask for penetration tests and things like that of your providers, all standard parts of a good third party risk management program. Make sure you've got centralized visibility into like all of your devices. So again, thinking outside the data center, make sure you've got visibility into every endpoint that connects to your network. Build some use cases out there too. And then make sure you've got some good ransomware resources, not just talking about EDR and things like that, just make sure you're aware of what's going on in the industry, look at what new ransomware things are out there, see if there's anything you can be doing like ahead of time to protect against this kind of thing. Other things that can help. So these are common factors that we've seen that will really help, teams reduce friction in securing your remote workers. Like, make sure you've got the capability for remote deployment of security tools, such as endpoint sensors and things like that, directly onto your users' endpoints, without having to stand up additional hardware. Like, make this a quick and easy process if possible. Make sure you've got the ability to update and harden prevention policies in minutes, like even maybe with endpoints that have gone off network, like using an MDM solution is a really, really good way of doing this. So you can set policies, make them roll out. As soon as someone switches a machine on and it connects to a network, it's going to get the latest policy straight away. Make sure you've got visibility to be able to investigate and triage alerts, regardless of where your teams or devices are located. So again, having an MDM solution in place is huge here. And then being able to audit and fix changes to endpoint configuration settings, like, BitLocker or, local firewalls, auto updates, patch levels, that kind of thing. Being able to do all that kind of stuff remotely and on the fly is hugely important. So. And that brings me to my Q&A.
Excellent. Okay, we have a few more questions that have come in as well that I'd like to see if we can get some feedback from you on. First, there's something that I actually also have noticed myself, right? So there's this issue of uptime, and absolutely critical with healthcare organizations 100%, but other types of organizations as well are absolutely concerned with this issue also. Financial institutions, other critical processes, business in general, right? So there's this threat when you think of ransomware, especially there's this threat of like extended downtime. And there's been a couple of conversations that I personally have been involved with recently where I'll ask somebody, about their thoughts about continuity and uptimes and service levels and those sorts of things. And they'll tell me something like, well, it just needs to run. It needs to be up. It needs to be available. And I kind of know what my response to those types of conversations has been, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about what you would think about that kind of a conversation.
You're always going to hit those challenges, I think. So, but you need to make sure as an organization you've got some kind of permission to do this kind of thing, right? You're always going to need time to do patching and things like that. It's like, ensure you've got some kind of high availability solution, right? So say you've got two servers that can run the same application, right? Take one offline, patch it, switch over to that one, take the other one offline, patch it. There you go. Both things are patched. But the tone at the top's kind of really important here as well. Like, you really need to ensure that as much as possible, your organization is not prioritizing like everything else over security. Like for a lot of businesses, especially small businesses, a significant data breach could put you out of business overnight. Make sure the people in the know in the organization, or the people need to know how important this is. A lot of it's just conversation and education.
And that quickly brings up the conversation about limited resources and prioritizing resources and competing for those types of resources. So what have you seen be effective as far as developing prioritizations for, pulling resources behind these types of activities, putting resources behind certain types of solutions, putting resources behind proper competency training, acquisition of staff, those kinds of things?
Again, make sure that the business knows the importance of this. Don't sit on the sidelines. get involved, be involved in projects and things like that. Make sure, be noisy, right? Make sure people know who you are and stress the importance of this. It's like, that's why, risk and audit professionals exist, right? We're here to protect the business, let them know where their risks are. So, I mean, ultimately, our role is to advise, and the business has got to prioritize, but make sure we are advising properly and letting people know what these risks are.
Here's a question that's coming in. A person saying that they're involved in GRC, but even with a solid program, there remain large gaps. For example, getting large corporations to respond to questions about their security posture. Even if Microsoft have responded to a questionnaire, we've seen at least 2 major incidents in the last 3 months. Availability with Teams, confidentiality with Exchange, breaches, these kinds of things. What ideas or suggestions do you have to still plug these existing types of gaps?
I mean, that's a great question, and I'm sure like this is some kind of frustration that like all of us like who work in third-party risk management have found. It's like getting a large organization to respond to an individual questionnaire, right, without saying, hey, we've got a compliance portal, just go out here and take a look at it. So how we would approach this kind of thing, it's important to still ask the questions, right? So take, for example, like recent SolarWinds breach, recent issues with Exchange, right? Proactively reach out to your vendors and ask the question directly, saying, hey, are you affected by this? Yes or no? If you are, what's your mitigation strategy? Like, when are these mitigations going to be in place? Like, can we follow up on this? It can be difficult to get that kind of answer out of someone like, Microsoft's a good example here. They're probably not going to answer you that directly, but there's probably resources that you can find. Like Microsoft will probably publish something like on a blog or put out some kind of bulletin saying like, hey, yes, we are affected and here's what we're doing, or no, we weren't affected at all. So, and then make sure anything you find is logged as a risk, and make sure that runs through your organization's risk management process. When are you checking up on that? What is your strategy for either accepting this or coming up with your own mitigation strategy?
Excellent. Here's an interesting question that's coming in. What are some of your thoughts about investing in artificial intelligence types of solutions as predictive models for future cyber attacks? Non-recognized types of events, non-recognized signatures, behaviors, those sorts of things. Do you have any thoughts or opinions about those?
Yeah, I mean, I think the use of AI is going to be huge as we move forward. So especially because, an AI can be trained to look out for like certain behavioral patterns, right? So AIs are going to know like how certain threat actors work, especially when they're working with like certain ransomware. Like the AI is going to know what this attacker needs to do to be successful, and it can maybe detect on that when it's happening. So the use of AI is going to be huge for the industry, I think, in the future.
Excellent. And here's another one that comes in. It's a specific question, and maybe you can also elaborate on this question. And this person is saying, can you please explain a little bit more about, secure file transfer protocol, SFTP, how that works? Is that as good as using APIs? So there's kind of a specific question there. And then maybe you can also elaborate more generally about identifying proper secure channels and protocols that are appropriate, and how to go about like recognizing when there is the right use of a protocol for a right type of data transfer, and how that type of analysis can be done.
Yeah, I mean, if you can use an API to do transfer between two systems, that's great, providing the API is secure and has right controls in place. So I would probably always prefer an API over like any other method. But going from there, SFTP is another good option. So basically, you don't want to be sending any sensitive data over plain text. So no HTTP, no regular FTP, really not over unencrypted email unless you're like absolutely secure that encryption is going to be enforced at both ends. Like, it's great if you send out with opportunistic TLS, right? So it's going to be encrypted on the way out, but then if your recipient doesn't support it, then it's just going to, come through as plain text. So yeah, secure channels always good. It's like Signal's a messaging app. I mentioned it earlier. So kind of, if you think of it similar to WhatsApp or something like that, but it's completely encrypted and completely secure. So that's a great way of sending information between, like, sending and receiving sensitive information. So we used Signal internally to do things like distribute passwords and that kind of thing, and keys, things like that. So messages have, like, you can set a life on the message. So after 6 hours, or even shorter, however you want it, like, the message isn't viewable anymore to anyone. So yeah, just never send anything over plain text. So kind of the way I like to think of it, if you're going to be sending something out, or you're asking someone to send you something and you're not sure whether it should go over a secure channel, just ask yourself this question. It's like, how would I feel if this was just available on the internet for anyone to look at, right? If that would cause you, like, some level of concern at all, then it needs to be sent over an encrypted channel or a secure channel.
Great. And first of all, there's some thank yous that are coming in. And so thank you very much for presenting this. I wonder if you could maybe kind of even give us your final thoughts about what the outlook of this type of threat and the effectiveness of our response sort of looks like in the future. Where do you see this all headed? We've sort of seen ransomware go through some surges in popularity, and right now it's terrible, right? So
Yeah.
where do you see this kind of headed?
I think the last year, the one thing it's really taught us all, and it's really made us be kind of like more prepared and more thoughtful about certain things, especially with the huge shift to remote work. Like, it's really taken people's security focus away from just thinking about, enterprise level security on data centers, network perimeters, and things like that. And now people are much more concerned about the endpoint, and that's where it should be. Like, a lot of problems happened, not just thinking ransomware. A lot of security incidents are just caused by human error, right? So people are much more thinking about, like, the human element, making sure they've got solid security awareness programs in place, as well as really protecting their endpoints. Like, the world's taken a massive shift in the last year, and are we ever really going to go back to how we were before? Like, is everyone going to go back to working in an office 5 days a week? Probably not. So it's really made organizations really think about where their security holes are and where they might be, and what's really important to protect. Is it just, a firewall appliance in a data center, or is it literally, this guy in accounting's MacBook Pro? So it's really opened people's eyes, I think. So it's
Yeah,
good.
for sure. Yeah, and on that note, we certainly look forward to a day when we'll be able to gather for these types of presentations, even someday in person again. We know that may not necessarily be a certain timeline for the moment, but we certainly look forward to when that sort of thing happens. So on behalf of the chapter, on behalf of the programming committee, on behalf of the community that's also participating and watching this, thanks so much, Nick, for presenting that session. I'm seeing multiple comments coming in, thanking you for the level of holistic approach and thoughtfulness and well thought out comments. So we really appreciate you taking the time to speak about this critical topic, absolutely for healthcare organizations, not only limited to healthcare organizations, other types of organizations as well. All of us as part of the distributed remote workforce, dealing with this challenge that for the foreseeable future is going to be with us. So we hope that you will also be with us in the foreseeable future, and some upcoming events that we'll be having, as well as our annual general meeting, which will be scheduled for May 12th, I think is the date that we tentatively have that there. And we would certainly love for you to be with us, if you would be willing to serve on the board as well. The board nomination window is open right now. You can obtain a self-nomination form from ISACA South Florida's website. There's a direct link at the very bottom of this, which you can do, but you can also just navigate to that domain at the top, ISACASFL.org, and you will find there under elections, you'll find a link to the nomination form, which you can submit yourself. It doesn't have to be submitted on behalf of someone else or from someone else. You can submit that yourself. They are due by March 19th. You got just a little bit over a week to get those in, and then we'll have our elections starting on April 1st. That will be sent out to the entire membership. You do need to be a member. You do need to be in active good standing at that point. And just as a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to renew your ISACA international membership and designate us as your chapter, then please go ahead and make sure that you do that. Do it as soon as possible, especially do it before April 1st, because if not, you actually won't be on the roster eligible to vote. So we want your participation. We desire it to be contributing in that process, and we welcome that as well. You can always reach out to us if you have any questions about that process or about any processes. And you can also reach out to Nick and Chris, who have been with us today on behalf of Red Canary. So we're grateful that they were. Here's some additional information of how to contact us. My email is there. I hear from a lot of you, and I appreciate that very much. president@isacasfl.org. There's also a membership email as well, a certification email, corporate relations for those of you who are involved with organizations that you think maybe could benefit from some direct interface or communication with the chapter. We welcome those types of communications also. And then academic relations. There's students who are participating in our sessions. Some of my students, I think, are even participating in some of our sessions, which I'm grateful for. And we always welcome that sort of participation. And we're thrilled now that there is actually a sponsored student chapter at Nova Southeastern University that is sponsored by ISACA South Florida. And so that chapter is recognized under the ISACA International umbrella as well. And so we look forward to continue with those types of relationships and continue hearing from you in the future. On that note, thanks very much. Have a great afternoon. I hope that you've enjoyed this lunch and learn. Feel free to reach out to Nick, to Chris. Feel free to reach out to ISACA South Florida. And we hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everyone.